Well, penultimate question I have for you then in this regard is, on the one hand, we have this situation with Iran now. It has very few options left. How much does it need a nuclear weapon as a, one, legitimization in the eyes of its people, but two, as a deterrent to stop further potential actions by the Israelis, possibly the US? Because as far as I can see, that's the only thing they can really rely on as the primary form of survival.
I don't think it needs it for domestic reasons. In fact, their official position, there is a fatwa, a religious edict against nuclear weapons. A nuclear-armed Iran is not necessarily, I don't think Iran is a suicidal regime. You've seen that even in the course of this war, that it was not willing to cross certain lines with regards to attacks on Israel because it was worried about decapitation. And, Iran that has a nuclear weapon is not going to be necessarily an Iran that launches that nuclear weapon preemptively at Israel or anyone else, but it's going to give them freedom of action to do all sorts of things. And it's going to be very, very difficult to deal with.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everyone, to part two. My guest today is Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator in Washington, D.C. We had a part one focusing on the war in Ukraine. Do encourage you to go and check that out. This conversation is about Russia, Iran, China, the broader geopolitical framework between those three, but also just, Dmitri, you've been talking a lot about the situation in Iran and their ability to weaponize uranium in a, bomb, so to speak. And you had a very interesting thread almost a month ago, which propelled me to reach out for this conversation because I was very interested to hear your thoughts about the propensity for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Simply put, the Russians have been against the Iranians developing nuclear capabilities of their own, and yet they seem to be working towards that. So could you outline a little bit your thoughts about what happened between Israel and Iran, but now where we are with this enrichment program and the capacity for them to actually get the weapon, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm now 2 for 2 in my public predictions of wars. I predicted early on, of course, that Putin would invade Ukraine. And in January of this year, I made a prediction that Israel would bomb Iran in a multi-day campaign against its nuclear sites this year. I didn't expect the United States to join in that fight, to be honest with you. I'm not sure anyone else did either, but I certainly thought that Bibi would go against it himself, which he did. I hope I'm going to be wrong on my third prediction, which is what my book is about, World on the Brink, that China would invade Taiwan somewhere in the next 3 to 7 years. Desperately hope I'm going to be wrong on that. Look, the Iranians had made a strategic decision many years back, at least 25 years, maybe even further back, to be a threshold nuclear power, to have the capability to quickly build a bomb, but not take that last step until they felt that the time was right. I think in retrospect, it had proven to be a remarkably foolish decision, and one that, by the way, no other power that had pursued nuclear weapons had chosen to do, right? Everyone else had basically tried to either race to the bomb as quickly as they possibly could or not pursue it at all. And the Iranians were unique in choosing that middle option. And it's foolish for two reasons that are now extremely obvious, which is that if you don't have a nuclear weapon, but you're pursuing one, you are, of course, a target for strikes like the ones we have just seen, and pressures, economic pressures like sanctions that they've been under for many years. And B, you don't have a deterrence mechanism to fight off and prevent those strikes, right? So that's why North Koreans rush to get a bomb. That's why Pakistan, India rush to get a bomb, and so many other nations. So the reason I became so confident that Israel would bomb Iranian nuclear program this year is really two reasons. One, Iran was getting closer and closer to irreversible capability, having enough enriched uranium up to almost weapons grade levels to quickly rush to a bomb. They had numerous facilities for both enrichment and conversion of uranium into gas to feed into the centrifuges, and then conversion into metal. To building the bombs, a lot of design work on neutron initiators for the bomb itself and other testing infrastructure, and building more and more facilities and deeper underground. So the ability to reverse it was increasingly getting to be out of range for Israel or even the United States. And B, that Iran, after October 7th, really was at its weakest point ever, with the decimation of its axis of resistance, so-called, these proxies that they've built up and supported, like Hezbollah and to some extent Hamas, and that they've surrounded Israel with, that they have helped to build up huge rocket arsenals for, that they thought would help deter a conflict with Israel. Israel, of course, decimated both of them in its campaigns. Israel benefited from Assad regime falling in Syria and Iran losing its influence there. But more importantly, the fact that Israel now had a direct flight path to Iran without going through a circular way, because it's a very long distance to fly to Iran. So the shorter you can make it, the better. And then in the exchanges of missile strikes last year, 2 of them, Israel decimated some of the most advanced air defenses that Iran had, the S-300s that they had gotten from the Russians. They had other indigenous systems that were much less capable. So if you're a BB, you're sort of looking at the situation where the program is getting dangerously close to being virtually impossible to stop, and Iran is its weakest point ever, which will not last. Hezbollah is trying to rebuild infrastructure, and who knows what might happen in Syria. The air defense systems, they might be able to get more from China or elsewhere. That's not going to hold forever. So if you're going to strike, now was the time to strike, right? And most importantly, he had a president in the White House, Donald Trump, that would give him the green light to do so, which I don't think that Biden would have done. And, it's one thing if you're doing a one-off strike without the permission of the US president, but if you're trying to launch a multi-day campaign where you are going to be targeted, you're going to need US help to identify the ballistic missiles that are flying at you and help shoot them down. You're going to need diplomatic cover in the UN Security Council to prevent them, the rest of the world from stopping you from continuing this war. Donald Trump gave help on all of those things, and I think there were real questions about Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, for that matter, doing any of it. So that is why I became confident in January that this strike would happen, and this is why it did happen, and it achieved a couple of things. There's all this debate right now of how far did it set back the Iranian nuclear program? Is it 3 months, 6 months, a year? I think it's probably closer to a year, maybe even more so, because there was widespread damage to all the components of this nuclear program. First of all, the Israelis just absolutely decimated the last step of it, which is the nuclear weapons research and design work. They have assassinated, I think at this point, the numbers are about 19 key nuclear scientists who have the knowledge right in their heads to help with this program, as well as the ballistic missile program. And they've decimated a lot of these facilities in Parchin military base and elsewhere. Secondly, they've sort of working back from the end state of a nuclear device. They've destroyed all the infrastructure that the Iranians used for mass conversion of enriched uranium into a metal form, where you can build it into a sphere to use in a bomb. So that has been destroyed. Further back, the enrichment facilities at Fordo clearly have been destroyed by those B-2 strikes, the MOPS. Hard to say whether that facility at Fordo is permanently destroyed or not, but almost certainly the centrifuges that are very, very finicky and very brittle were wiped out in that facility. And then there were strikes on the Natanz facilities, which are above ground as well, were impacting significantly the enrichment capability. Then further down, you have the centrifuge manufacturing facilities that were targeted. Not all of them were destroyed, because some of them are so deep underground that even the MOPS, the massive ordnance penetrators, can't reach them, but clearly an impact there. And then the facilities that convert the yellow cake uranium into gas form, hexafluoride gas that feeds into the centrifuges, were destroyed as well, right? So not everything is completely eliminated, particularly the centrifuge making capabilities. And the Iranians have alleged that they are building, right before the war actually, a new facility. They didn't say where it was, that's even deeper underground for enrichment. Not clear that it's anywhere close to being operational yet. But if they have ability to manufacture centrifuges and that facility at some point comes online, that'll be a problem. They'll still have to rebuild all the other components. But clearly the program has been set back. But even more importantly than that, I think, is the precedent that has now been set by both Israel and the United States that this is not a one-off. That as Iran, if it decides to continue to pursue enrichment, there'll be further strikes, right? And the strikes may not just be on the program itself, but maybe on the leadership, right? In this particular conflict, it's pretty clear that the United States, prevented Israel from doing a leadership decapitation strike, going after Ayatollah Khamenei and his key advisors. But they did go after the IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard leadership, and absolutely decimated it. So if you're in Tehran right now, you've got a real dilemma on your hands. I think you need to sort of reevaluate whether being a threshold nuclear power makes any sense at all, and really decide which path you're going to take, either trying to race to a bomb, and now you're probably at least a year away, and you're going to be incredibly vulnerable to more strikes, including decapitation strikes, while you're pursuing it, or choose another path and decide that maybe nuclear weapons are not for you. I think they're still shell-shocked and sort of on autopilot in terms of their policy, and haven't really made a decision one way or another. They don't want to look like they're just caving. They want to portray, if for no other reason than for domestic audience, that they're standing strong to the U.S. and the Europeans and Israel. So there might be some really tough negotiations ahead. So I'm not predicting how it's going to end and what path they're going to choose, because they've never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity in the past. So they may do so again, but they're not in great shape. And I think a really strategic victory was achieved here, not just in setting back the program, but to send a clear message how vulnerable Iran is and how incredibly penetrated their society is to further action, covert action and overt kinetic action.
They've certainly become a lot more vulnerable. They've lost the entire Shia crescent. And more broadly, the role, this notion that Iran was one of these big autocratic entities, part of this autocratic axis, globally that is, or anti-Western bloc, is sort of really diminished. And, well, simply, is that why they're seeking to potentially allow IAEA representatives to visit the sites now? I believe I saw a report July 23rd stating as such.
Yeah, look, they're concerned about a number of things. One, that there'll be even more snapback sanctions that the Europeans are threatening to do to further weaken its economy, which is already in terrible shape even before the war. The war has not made things any better and has inflicted likely billions of dollars worth of economic damage on Iran. So they don't want to see that happen. They don't want to see a resumption of strikes by Israel, maybe even the United States. So I think they have to at least show that they're somewhat playing along, taking into account the domestic concerns about looking like they're caving, because there is sort of a lot of propaganda that the regime has used against IAEA, that they're just a spy ring for Mossad or the CIA. So they're sort of cornered themselves rhetorically in many ways, particularly with their domestic audience. But on the other hand, things can certainly get much, much worse for them economically, militarily. So they have to find some sort of common ground. They don't have many good options.
No. And considering the broader geopolitical situation, naturally, you mentioned the Europeans, the E3, Britain, France, Germany are looking more united on a lot of issues, given the recent bilateral signings they've done, including on Iran. But there is a divergence here with the Americans over this. And then, of course, there are the Chinese and the Russians to consider in this. Can you take us through a little bit how you look at these broader players and whether or not there could be conflicts there which embolden the Iranians still?
I think it's remarkable that you had Israel bombing Iran nonstop for 12 days. Obviously, Iran trying to retaliate with ballistic missiles, but it was an Israel-initiated war. And no one in Europe, virtually no one in Europe, has said a negative thing about it, right? And I think that's not because of Israel or their deep love for Israel. Clearly, they don't have any for the most part. It's because they were afraid of Donald Trump, and because Donald Trump came out fairly early on with a strong endorsement of this conflict, and then later joined in for a strike as well. And they didn't want to get on the bad side of him, particularly with the NATO meeting that was taking place, where they really needed to make sure that he didn't pull out of NATO, and obviously trying to get him to support Ukraine as well. So that was just absolutely remarkable, right? Again, I think if you had Joe Biden as president or Kamala Harris as president, this is not a political statement. I don't think you would have had the strikes to begin with. And if you did, I think the entire community, including America, would have tried to push Israel to end this war early. And that just didn't happen this time around. And I think it's largely because of Donald Trump's support for it and support for Bibi and the Europeans really not wanting to cross him on that. Everyone's concerned about the Iranian nuclear program. Of course, no one wants to see Iran go nuclear, but how far are you going to go in preventing that is really a question of degrees. Israel views it as essential to itself, its own interests. America is incredibly concerned about it. I think everyone else much less so. Even the Russians and the Chinese don't want to see Iran have a nuclear weapon, but I think they're willing to live with it if they have to, and certainly not willing to do a whole lot to stop it. And use their ability to pressure Iran to stop it. But they don't want to see more proliferation, and Iran borders Russia, at least in the Caspian Sea. So it's very, very close for comfort, too close for comfort for Russia to have another nuclear power on its borders, who is somewhat friendly today, but that doesn't need to last. Certainly when you're dealing with religious regimes like Iranian regime, you never know how it's going to end up. So the Russians are concerned, which is why you're now seeing Putin sort of attempting to be the mediator in this crisis and saying, we'd be happy to help, and by the way, make some money on this by taking the enriched uranium out of Iran and supplying them with low enriched uranium that they need for their nuclear program, something that the Iranians, of course, have had no interest in. They want to keep that indigenous enrichment capability to have an option to build a nuclear device at some point. But the Russians are trying to step in and try to look like they're helpful, but also make money on it.
Of materialism and self-interest, realpolitik coming to the fray when it comes to Russia and Iran then, because I just don't see them doing anything more. Iran is a husk of its former self, and whilst I was always on the fence, well, frankly, not realistic about regime change, quote unquote, clearly, well, what did the Russians do in this instance? They just focus on Ukraine and forget about it, or they still need Iran to be around, if that makes sense?
They're no longer dependent on Iran for any significant military capabilities, right? They got the licenses for the Shaheds, which they're now manufacturing in Russia, and have evolved those designs significantly, as I mentioned. So they don't really need much from Iran at this point. And look, I think this war really highlighted the fallacy of the so-called axis of axis of disruptors, as some have called it, that China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia somehow aligned in everything and have this counter NATO or counter the West pact. There is no pact. In fact, the Iranians have had no help in this war, not from Russia, not from China. And even after this war, they clearly went to Moscow asking for help in resupplies and new air defense batteries to, replace those that have been destroyed by Israel. And they've gotten nowhere because Russia doesn't have any to offer, any to spare, because they need them all in Ukraine. Or to defend key Russian infrastructure in Russia against Ukrainian drone attacks. So there is no alignment beyond a very transactional relationship. And by the way, when Iranians were helping the Russians with Shaheds and other munitions, it was not of the goodness of their heart. They were getting paid for it, right? So they got paid in gold by the Russians for that support. There is no axis. There is some very loose joint interests in some areas and not so joint in others, and a lot of tensions as well, where the Russians' interests are in the Middle East is not necessarily always aligned with Iranian interests. So, the only unifying thing for all of them is their hatred of the West and America and trying to curtail American influence, but that's not enough to have an axis. And you're seeing now that play out in a very real way this summer.
I guess one of the penultimate question I have for you then in this regard is, on the one hand, we have this situation with Iran now. It has very few options left. How much does it need a nuclear weapon as a, one, legitimization in the eyes of its people, but two, as a deterrent to stop further potential actions by the Israelis, possibly the US? Because as far as I can see, that's the only thing they can really rely on as the primary form of survival.
I don't think it needs it for domestic reasons. In fact, their official position is that there is a fatwa, a religious edict against nuclear weapons from Khamenei that was issued over 20 years ago. So, the messaging both externally and to their public is not only are we not pursuing nuclear weapons, they're evil and, against God's will. So they don't need it for domestic reasons. Clearly for deterrence, they did want it. A nuclear armed Iran is not necessarily, I don't think Iran is a suicidal regime. And you've seen that even in the course of this war, that it was not willing to cross certain lines with regards to attacks on Israel. And because it was worried about decapitation. And, while there is a martyrdom culture there, I don't think the leader wants to die, and the people around him want to die necessarily. And they're perfectly willing to have, nobody's, lose their lives in the pursuit of their objectives, but not themselves. And, Iran that has a nuclear weapon is not going to be necessarily an Iran that launches that nuclear weapon preemptively at Israel or anyone else, but it's going to give them freedom of action to do all sorts of things. And it's going to be very, very difficult to deal with, right? You're seeing this play out with Pakistan, with North Korea, where, they're doing all kinds of nefarious things that we just have no ability to influence in any way beyond, sanctions and the like, because they're nuclear powers, right? And you have to take that into account when you consider any sort of punishment measures. So it's going to give Iran enormous influence and power in the region if they get a nuclear weapon, which is why, one of the reasons why the Israelis are so concerned about it, and frankly, the rest of the Arab world as well. You had MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, that had said on American television, I believe a year or two ago, that if Iran gets a nuclear device, Saudi Arabia will pursue one immediately. Right, so that's how the region views it as well.
Last question for this mammoth conversation we've had, but really, really good. I hope people have enjoyed it. Is simply, what would you encourage people to look out for in this theatre?
Well, you're going to have these negotiations that are going to take place with Europeans and Americans, between them and Iran, on the future of the nuclear program. The Trump administration has insisted since the beginning here on a zero indigenous enrichment line, that there will be no enrichment. There might be a consortium of players, including regional players, that can build facilities to enrich for Iran, to provide Iran with low enrichment fuel for its nuclear program, the civilian nuclear program, which is legitimate, but no highly enriched uranium, that capability that Iran would possess domestically. Iranians refuse to accept that line. They say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that was negotiated all the way back in the late 60s and early 70s, that they have a right to enrichment, which is true, that the treaty, while prohibits pursuit of nuclear weapons, allows countries to have indigenous enrichment. And there are a number of countries around the world that are not nuclear powers that have indigenous enrichment. They're under IAEA inspections and controls, and none of them are enriching to the levels that the Iranians have, right? So, for a nuclear program, you really need 4 or 5% enrichment. The Iranians first went to 20, where there are very, very few legitimate uses for it outside of nuclear weapons, and then they went to 60, which there's virtually no uses outside of nuclear weapons. And the problem with those high levels of enrichment is that it's not a linear scale. So the effort to go from 5% to 20% or 60% is enormous and takes many, many months. Well, once you're at that level, to get to 90% or so, which is a weaponization level, takes days, right? So it gets progressively easier at the highest enrichment levels, which is very concerning because, if you've got days in which you can get to 90% enrichment, very quickly convert it to a metal sphere, put it inside a bomb, and boom, you've got a nuclear device. That's going to be very difficult to stop, right? So that's why people focus on keeping them at those low enrichment levels and enforcing that through inspections. So we shall see what happens. The Iranians, I think their inclination is going to be to drag this out as long as possible and to try to deny and deflect, as they've always done, that there's anything nefarious that's going on, and insist on their right to enrich. We will see if the both economic pressure and the threat of further actions by Israel and or US gets them to really make significant concessions here and get something that is better than JCPOA, right? And JCPOA, by the way, Donald Trump pulled out of it back in 2018, but it was a decent deal. It was not a great deal. And the main issue with the JCPOA was that it had sunset provisions, right? So it had very tough inspections and reductions in Iranian highly enriched stockpiles. But then a lot of those provisions would expire in 10 or 15 years. So starting really this year, had it stayed in place. And then by 2030s, more and more restrictions would be lifted. So at a minimum, I think the Trump administration would want to insist on no sunset provisions, very tough inspections permanently. But we shall see where it ends up. I think the Iranians, having just suffered incredible humiliation, incredible devastation to their nuclear program, ballistic missile program, and overall military, particularly the IRGC, would be smart to say this long-term pursuit of a nuclear weapon program that had actually started under the Shah in the 70s and then paused for a while, and then Khamenei during the Iraq-Iran war restarted it. So it's been going on for well over 30 years, 35 years maybe. The longest pursuit of a nuclear weapons program in history without actually achieving one. And that it hasn't done Iran any favors. It hasn't been in their self-interest that, you either try to get a bomb quickly if you can or not pursue it at all. Those seem to me the more rational choices for Iran to make. But it hasn't been hot on smart, rational choices in the past. So not sure we'll get there.
Well, we'll just have to have you back in the fall, in the autumn to cover again what the developments are there, as well as obviously in part one on Ukraine. And I do encourage everyone to check out your book, World on the Brink, which is very nicely positioned on your shelf behind you and will be in the description as well. But everyone, thanks very much for watching. If you have any thoughts, do drop them below and subscribe for future conversation with Dmitri and, more of my own analysis as well. Take care, everyone.